All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Happy Wednesday afternoon, February the 25th. Mm. We're going to be talking about power and inequality for the next, probably like 2 weeks. We have finally arrived at the point where we can discuss these issues of power. Um, as I have said, at different points in the beginning of the semester, sociological theory is really incomplete without a theory of power. So, in looking at these questions of like structure and agency that we've been looking at in the first few weeks, um, power is a really important component of the structure. To use the metaphor that we've come back to the last few weeks, couple weeks, um, power is really the ability to decide what's on the menu for people. Power is the part of the structure that decides how many life chances we have or don't have to succeed, to prosper, to even just live. So power is an essential part of sociology. And as I said when we were talking about micro sociology, I think that micro sociology, like Irving Goffman, these folks have, tremendous insights into society, but they're limited insights insofar as they don't take power into consideration, insofar as they don't look at the macro sociological structures of power and inequality and bring that into their micro sociology. I think that people like Irving Goffman, for as brilliant as they are limited in terms of their ability to provide us a larger sociological theory. So we have finally arrived at the point where we can discuss power. I'll today's class. I'll give us kind of an overview, going back to sort of classical theories of power from Karl Marx and Max Weber, and then we'll kind of preview the readings that we'll be doing in the next 2 weeks that come from some of the most important contemporary ideas about power, particularly C. Wright Mills's book called The Power Elite, a real classic written during 1956. Um, Also, we'll be looking at the theories of power that have come from Timothy Lukes and Michael Mann, who have especially in the case of Michael Mann, a very wide-ranging historical look at power in all kinds of different societies, what's sometimes called a comparative historical theory or sociological theory, where they, as the name suggests, they compare different societies and different civilizations over the course of time in order to develop a more general theory of how power works in economics, in politics, in the military, in ideology. And these are all what Michael Mann calls the sources of social power. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion in the next few weeks. Um, Announcements, reminder that there will be no class on Monday. This should be the only time where I have to cancel a live class meeting because I will be traveling. I'll be coming back from a weekend conference in the city of Montreal. And so I'll basically be flying the friendly skies all day on Monday. It's very long. It's a long flight. Um, Also, the other announcement is that I guess a sort of a reminder that you have a quiz that will be due that Monday. And as I mentioned in the last class, the quiz is kind of a review of the first, 5 weeks of the class and the readings that we've been doing during that time. Um, and again, a reminder that these quizzes are things that you can like open up and look at the questions and then come back to. So it's more of an open book test or a take home exam in that sense that you can use all of the materials at your disposal to answer the questions. So, just a reminder about that. It's on Canvas. It should otherwise be pretty self-explanatory. Um, so, with that, I think we should get into the readings for this section of the class. We'll go to the screen share and pull these up. Flip the perusal. Okay. I also have another poll for you today. Um, so I'm excited to discuss that one. It will be, again, themed on this question of power and inequality, and particularly power over the government, which groups have more or less power to make things happen in Washington, D.C. today. So, as the readings suggest here, as the editors kind of set us up for these readings, power and inequality are indeed two central concepts in sociology. And so, like I said, they don't necessarily explain everything. You can't, I think only understand the world by looking through the lens of power and inequality. But conversely, I would say that you can't understand the world adequately without addressing these issues of power and inequality. No sociological theory can be complete without this. And so, in the way that we've tried to sort of bridge macro and micro sociology or bridge structure and agency, power has really been the missing concept or the missing element to this point in the semester. And these were, as it says here, these have deep roots in sociology that go back to the classical theories of Marx and Weber. So everybody that we're going to read in this next 2 weeks has been to some extent like influenced by both Marx and Weber on these questions of power. The other third key sociological theorist, of course, is Emile Durkheim. But Durkheim didn't have as much to say about power. Durkheim, as we saw, had a lot of influential ideas about rituals and about culture and about like the symbolic nature of social life, language and religion and things of that matter. So, Durkheim is certainly an important figure, but when it comes to questions of power, he had less to say. Whereas Marx and Weber had a lot to say about these things. For Marx, this is really at the center of his theory of historical materialism, the way in which power for Marx is really rooted in economics, and in particular in class. So that power, in other words, is rooted in wealth, in money, in ownership of what Marx called the means of production. So those with power in a capitalist society are those who own the businesses, they own the factories. Today they own the tech companies, they own the media conglomerates. They're the owning class. Today we would call them, the 1% or, the billionaire class. They are people who, by virtue of their money and their power, their wealth, have the ability to exercise extraordinary power over the government, over the media, over society at large, right? So it's pretty hard to deny that this is going on in our world today from the perspective of 2026. Marx's theory about class power certainly hold a lot of explanatory value. It's kind of hard to deny that, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on today, it's hard to deny that that the billionaires and the 1% exercise an extraordinary amount of power over our society, at all kind of dimensions, in all the institutions, in all of the spheres of social life. It's money and wealth and ownership that really are the roots of power. And so I don't think that that really needs a whole lot of further explanation. As it says here, in his analysis of capitalist societies, Marx went on to suggest that capitalists, by virtue of the power they possess in the economic realm, also possess the ability to influence other institutions, political, cultural, religious, and so forth, in their favor. Right? So we live in this time where the wealthy have extraordinary power over the government. They have extraordinary power over the media. I mean, just this last, I don't know, 6 months, we've seen these cases where people like Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert are censored because they're saying things on their late night shows that the billionaires who own CBS and Paramount don't want to hear, and the president, who's a billionaire, doesn't want to hear. And so they have taken, various efforts to censor and regulate within the media, not to mention the fact that the world's richest man, Elon Musk, owns Twitter, that Jeff Bezos, who, runs Amazon, owns the Washington Post and, one of the country's most prestigious newspapers, and has really systematically dismantled that newspaper in just the last month or so, laid off a bunch of journalists and people who were working as foreign correspondents and that sort of thing. So all of these are direct examples of the what Marx saw in his time in the 1840s and 50s and 60s is probably more true today. That, like, those who have the wealth, those who have the money, those who have the ownership of the means of production also have control and power over the other institutions of the society, particularly the state, the media, the educational system, the healthcare system, all those institutions that we talked about last time. Max Weber, as it explains here, is picks up and was influenced to a large extent by Marx's ideas, but then also tried to add that there were other sources of power as well, in addition to money and class and wealth and that sort of thing. Weber offered what he called like a multi-dimensional theory of power or a pluralistic theory of power as a kind of an alternative to Marx. He kind of said, Marx was maybe like a little too reductionist in his analysis, where he, kind of like reduced power to matters of class. And Weber said, no, there are other factors at work too. Weber didn't deny that class was an important part of power, but he said that there were also other factors that are not necessarily reducible to social class. And so, in his famous essay on this, he wrote about concepts of status and social honor. He wrote about political party and political power in a way where he said that these were not simply reducible to class, wealth, and money, but that they have their own kind of like autonomy or independence, or at least like relative autonomy or relative independence from class, that they were institutions that, exercised power in a way that was not simply reducible to money, wealth, and ownership. So, Max Weber, as we will see, offers a kind of an alternative that is more like pluralistic than Marx, who really saw power as kind of like rooted in class. And so this is a long-standing debate in sociology. It continues to this day, between basically like the adherents of Marx and the adherents of Weber, between Marxists and Weberians, about the nature of power and how much like class determines power versus how much like other factors come into play in addition to class. No one disputes that class is a form of power. It's a question of how strong the relationship is. And so for the Marxists, class and power are more strongly related to one another, whereas for Weber, I suppose the Weberians, I suppose they think it's a little bit more complicated. Okay. So I hope that gives us a starting point for thinking about how these like lineages of social theory have affected our contemporary theories of power and where power is rooted. Having sort of set this up, we're going to look a little bit later into like kind of this introduction gives us a good overview of like Marxist theories of power that are more contemporary, and then more like kind of Weberian theories of power. And then it introduces some of the readings that we have in the next couple of weeks from Mills, Mann, and Luke's. So that's kind of like what's up ahead. Let me turn to, though, a poll that I found. Um, it's done a little while ago, but I think that the results are pretty evergreen. I mean, I think that they would be pretty much the same if we did the poll today. In other words, it's basically 10 questions. Okay. So it's basically like questions there. It's 10 questions, but they're all the same structure. And they're basically asking people, do you think that these different groups have too much or too little power over the government in Washington, D.C.? So the first question asks, do large businesses have too much or too little power over the government in Washington, D.C.? And so the range of answers are, you can say too much, you could say too little, you could say just about right, you know, um, or you can say not sure. So remember, you always got to have the not sure or no opinion response for people, right? So the first question asks like about large businesses. The second asks, do working people have too much or too little power over the government in Washington, D.C.? The third one asks, do small businesses have too much or too little power over the government in Washington, D.C.? The fourth question asks, do wealthy people have too much or too little power over the government in Washington, D.C.? The fifth question asks, do poor people have too much or too little power over the government? The sixth question asks, do political lobbyists have too much or too little power? Seventh question asks, do the news media have too much or too little power? The eighth question has is, does Wall Street have too much or too little power? The ninth question asks, do seniors have too much or too little power? And the 10th and final question is, do people like you have too much or too little power? I think that's kind of an interesting way to phrase it in the survey, because then it has like a subjective judgment about like, um, I'm assuming like, you know, none of you are billionaires, but who knows, so like, that is a more like subjective question, when you phrase it that way, to like, do people like you have too much or too little power? I guess it depends on which side of the of things you stand on. So let me give a couple more um, minutes for people to peruse these and answer. Please do answer them if you're here in the live session. Try to answer them in the next like minute or two. If you're watching on online archive, this would be a good place to comment if you feel particularly strong about some of these, or you want to kind of explain your thoughts or your decision making. Um, and then when I'm not getting any more responses, I will um, I'll compare them to the regular survey. I have not figured out a way that people who are watching the online archive can view these survey results or these surveys as I've launched them. Um, I am sorry about that, but I don't really know what to do. So that's why I sort of described the questions in length. I guess this is a good time for me to again make a plea for, if more of you to come to the live sessions if you're able to do so. I certainly understand that many of you are not able to do so. So if you're here in the session, though, please do vote so that we have some, um, just as much data as we can to go off of. Just give you another like minute. Okay, it looks like we have more unanimity in the results here. More of you basically answering the same thing without a lot of variation, and that is indeed what the poll results suggest. I found these interesting. I would have liked to have known, just as we did in the last session, I would have liked a breakdown by political party, just as we had with the institutions poll last week, but I couldn't find one like that. Um, but I still thought that this was like a pretty good question. So like, you can see from the results here though that like there's pretty wide disparities. Like people are not really on the fence about these things. Like people, 82% of people say that wealthy people have too much power, and only 4% say that people have too little power, right? And so that has to cross political parties, which is, I think, interesting. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, pretty much everyone thinks that billionaires or wealthy people or whatever have too much power over the government, and yet, you know, they just like elected a billionaire to the presidency. A year and a half ago, and like, here in San Francisco, the mayor of the city is like a billionaire who, is the heir to the Levi Strauss fortune. Um, we have like billionaires getting elected and holding office all over the country. Um, and then conversely, like, do working people have too much or too little power over the government? All four of you respondents said too little. And indeed, this was like the breakdown in of all of those polled. 69% of people said too little, and only 2% of people said too much. Um, this is an interesting finding because, like, if we had asked this poll, I don't know, maybe 50 or 60 years ago, the results might have been different. 50 or 60 years ago, unions were much stronger in this country than they are today. It was something like uh, close to half of workers were represented by a union to some extent. Now, union density, especially in the private sphere, is at a record low in terms of people who are represented by organized labor in some way. You know, yeah. Go ahead, Kai.
I find it interesting when you're talking about unions, having more power back then than they do now. Like I know Delta Airlines flight attendants, they don't have a union, and a good portion of them are like anti-union. You would think, because of the union, like people like me who are black or people who are larger, or people who wear glasses or people who are like back in the day to be like a flight attendant, you had to like meet certain criteria and the union is the one who made it more like, more open for everyone to, apply and to work this job. And, you know, my airline has a union, but it's just very interesting that, the forces that made it possible for you to do this job, you're like very anti them. Like there's like a good portion of them that work diligently to make sure that they don't unionize. And it's interesting that that's happening, in 2026.
That's interesting, Kai. So, can you tell me, or just your best guesstimate, like, how many of the airlines, like the American Airlines, are represented by a union?
Most of them are like my airline has a union. We're with the AFA, and I think the AFA covers like Alaska. I think they might do American too. But Delta, which is like one of the big threes, who's like, you know, glamorized in like the media and like, just like all across the board as far as like airlines go, they don't have a union and they there's like the A like the AFA is working towards getting them unionized, but there's like a very large portion of them that do not want it. but it,
The flight attendants don't want the union.
yeah, the flight attendants don't want it.
Do you know why?
I think it's because Delta throws money at the flight attendants. I think Southwest makes the most, and I think maybe Alaska. I don't know, but I know South or Delta Airlines. They, incentivize them to be anti-union by like giving them large amounts of money just for like little things, And but the thing about Delta is that they don't have a contract. So if they mess up, like if there's nothing to protect them, they don't have any protection whatsoever, which I find interesting. Like, it's really just about if your supervisor really likes you or not. And if your supervisor doesn't like you or just have like a vendetta against you, you can be fired like that and you have no protection, no nothing. So like that their company really, tries to like get them because they don't want them to unionize, and unfortunately, a lot of them buy into it. But it's like I know the money is good, I'm sure it is, but it's like, do you not value protection? And once again, these unions are the ones who made it so that you can do this. Like flight attendants now are like, gay, they're black, they're Hispanic, they're, everything, and back in the day, it really wasn't like that, at all. So I just find it interesting.
That's a really good point too, the latter point. I mean, like in the 1950s, 1960s, when unions were at their strength, they were predominantly like white male organizations, and they were more like conservative in that sense. They bargained for higher wages and better working conditions for their workers, but they were otherwise they had a pretty like conservative effect on the government. And now, as the working class itself is changed, it's become less white, it's become less male, it's become, more diverse in all sorts of different ways. The face of the union movement has really kind of changed along with it. So that's a significant and substantial difference. Um, a lot of the earlier unions were kind of like, unions could even be kind of like exclusionary. They could exclude, immigrants or certain kinds of, certain other types of workers on the grounds that like, they would like kind of drag the membership down or drag wages down if we included them. And so they were more, kind of exclusive in nature. Yeah, I know. Like you would think that like, organizations that are, at least in theory, devoted to, um, like workplace democracy, in like workers having a voice and workers being able to better conditions, that they would have a more, kind of democratic and inclusive approach. But a lot of them didn't, like the Teamsters and stuff. They were not. Um,
Yeah, I'm surprised. Like I didn't know that, but I guess it makes sense, back in the day, I guess, men were like dominant in like the workforce, so I guess they wanted to like protect their interest and their interest only. So I guess it makes sense just in theory, you would think otherwise, but I guess in practice, yeah, it makes sense.
yeah, yeah. In theory, is you wouldn't think that that would be the case. And in theory, yeah, it's like, and there's always been people that have said this, but they weren't necessarily like in power in the unions, but they're always like, well, if you want to, the only way to improve everyone's wages and working conditions is to take care of the lowest among the membership. Like there's an expression like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So that like you have to have solidarity with immigrant workers or black workers or women workers to pull everybody's wages and working conditions up. Otherwise, everybody gets kind of like dragged down. Um, and so that kind of like should be the approach. And often it was the approach, but not always. Like sometimes, certain kinds of unions that represented certain kinds of jobs, or certain kinds of professions, they acted in a more kind of like exclusionary way. And ultimately, I think to their detriment. I think that ultimately that was not a good decision, just purely out of the self interest of those unions, much less like their moral compass. Yeah, thank you for uh, you know offering your experience and sharing what it's like in the airlines. I often think about this. It's good to know that Delta is not unionized because I'll think about that next time I choose my airlines. I'll be like, oh, this is the scab airline. Yeah. I mean, in recent years, it's been, we've seen like, there have been these union drives, especially at Amazon and Starbucks, right? Like these are the places where like the Amazon warehouses, like the first one was in Staten Island, New York. They unionized and they successfully unionized that warehouse, despite the fact that Amazon threw, millions of dollars in all sorts of ways to try to convince workers to vote against the union. You know, everything from like, annoying advertisements to like really hardcore, aggressive tactics. Yeah, go ahead, Jill.
My when I was a kid, my mom used to work at Foster Farms Dairy, which is Crystal Creamery. They make milk and they send it all over the place. If you go in the grocery store, that's where it is.
Yeah.
And she, yeah, I don't exactly know her role exactly, but she was like in the managerial office.
Mhm.
And she was telling me about unions when I was a kid to my little child mind. And she was complaining about it. And I'm, in my head, like, no, that sounds like a good thing that people can come there. Right.
You're kind of like
And
breaking,
she
you're
would always
breaking up
say,
a little
no,
bit.
it's, oh, sorry. Can you
That's
hear me
okay.
now? Is
Yeah, yeah,
that better? Okay.
yeah.
But she would always say, when somebody like messes something up, the union protects them when they should get fired,
Mm,
and so that was kind of her mentality.
hmm.
She is a very right-leaning individual, but she would always say, an employee went in and they stole ice cream off the line or something like that, and they should be fired, but the union protects them. And so in
Uh,
my mind, I think, you know, upper management corporations don't really want people to unionize because they don't want to have that protection plan, et cetera.
yeah, they don't. They want to maintain the
Hmm.
decision making over hiring and firing.
So I could see kind of why, a large corporation like Delta doesn't, it tries to like convince their staff members to not unionize, or why they
Yeah,
would try to say, oh, unions are bad, because they don't want to have um, that oppositional force.
yeah.
But
Because it's a
I'm
power
not saying it's
struggle.
right, but yeah, for
Because yeah,
sure.
because ultimately it comes down to like power.
Absolutely.
It's just like who has the power to negotiate these things, and workers, if they don't have a union, they don't really.
Hmm.
They're just like individual little, disconnected.
Staff members, what is it?
Yeah,
Cogs in a machine. They're all just cogs in a machine if they don't come together as the powerhouse that can fight back and speak up for themselves.
yeah. Like they don't have power. They only have power in numbers. Workers basically. Like as individuals, we're all kind of like powerless. Go ahead, Kai.
It's interesting with my union. I won't lie, like we're going through contract negotiations now, and there's like a part of me that's like maybe it will be better for like Delta, and like don't have a union, because
Hmm.
so many of us are like financially struggling right now. And I've been with yeah, we've just, a lot of us are financially struggling. And you see, other airlines like Delta who don't have a union, you're just like, oh, life just seems like it's so easy there. And maybe, I guess, Jill's right. Like, that's like the whole idea, like, hey, you don't have to have a union and struggle. Like, here, here's some money, like, and they know that, I don't know. So, there is like, I am pro union, I really am, because at the end of the day, I understand it's like basically like like taking away power from these big corporations and putting it into the people in their interests, But
Hmm.
there is like sometimes a part of me that wonders, like, are they like, theoretically in bed together, like,
Hmm.
are they all kind of just doing this and low key just like working together, to like screw us all over and like have their interests and like have this facade that we're really trying to help you, but really, we're kind of low key trying to help each other, and like I won't lie, I like still, I don't know, like, there's like that whisper even at my airline that a lot of people feel that way, and it's easy not to buy into that, especially when you don't see a lot of progress happening.
Yeah. I can offer my own anecdotes about that. Like there is within my union that represents, us as teachers, there's a real rift between like the leadership and the rank and file. And that's not uncommon either. There are the rank and file workers like myself, and then there are the people that represent us. And sometimes there's like a disconnect, and sometimes they are kind of like in bed with each other, as you say, like where there's a cozier relationship that management has with the union leadership, if not like the rank and file ordinary workers. Go ahead, Jill.
Yeah. It's kind of nerve-wracking sometimes when there's a union that's like speaking for everybody and stuff. My partner, he works at BART, which is Bay Area Rapid Transit. They
Yeah.
all the public train systems that lead from the Outer Bay and go into San Francisco, et cetera. And they're losing funding and they're actually in like contract negotiations and they're talking about going on strike.
Uh-huh.
Their union is talking about going on strike, and like that's a little unsettling because it's like, okay, you go on strike, and now we have to figure out our personal finances and all that stuff. Like, was the union a good idea? But I like the overall picture. I think it's a good idea, but sometimes things come down, and you're like, oh man, that's a little scary.
Yeah, it can be. I have no doubt about it. I hope, and I would imagine that the unions usually have like what they call a strike fund, so that they can help partially fund people if there's a loss of income. Here in San Francisco, we just had the first educators strike, teachers strike in the city since 1979, so 47 years. And, it generally seems like the teachers won that strike. They reached a bargain, I guess it was, I don't know, a week or two ago. So I'm not sure if they've voted on the tentative offer yet, but for the most part, like the union certainly declared victory. They got a good, the teachers got a good raise. They sort of brought up people who were, among the lowest paid. And really the key deciding factor was that there's real active community support. I could see it just driving around San Francisco, where there'd be people on the picket lines, everywhere in, in different parts of the city, not just like teachers, but like community members and parents and like people that would bring food and, people that would try to, help, bring sunscreen and, all this kind of stuff, as mutual aid for the strikers, or people just like, honking their horns in support. There was a real community support that didn't just simply involve the people who themselves were the workers, but everybody, lots of people in the city that, you know, I think recognize how important teachers are, not just for like, you know, teaching arithmetic and English and stuff, but, as like caretakers of children. And, when it's a teacher strike, the people that really feel it first are the parents who, depend on sending their kids to school so that they can, do their own work and their own jobs and things like that. And like, if you have a kid home with you all the time, like a lot of parents experienced during COVID, it's really hard to work. It's really hard to carry on life as usual if you don't if you can't send your kid to school. So that was a real, that that was a big kind of thing here that happened just in the last like couple of weeks here in San Francisco where I am. And you know, it just it just kind of reminded me of this sort of thing. There are certainly people that believe that the teachers union have, too much power, and um, but I'm not inclined to agree with that. Um, just looking at the rest of these poll results and things, I mean, we're pretty unanimous. It's really striking again to look at this poll where there's not a lot of like in between. There's pretty much a large consensus that wealthy people, large businesses, political lobbyists, and Wall Street, and even the news media, have too much power over the government. And pretty much like all of you, there was a pretty like broad consensus um, in the polling here, and conversely, that poor people, people like you, small businesses, and working people don't have enough power. Again, this has not always been the case in America. Like after World War II and into the 1950s, like working people had a much greater say that, especially like within the Democratic Party, unions had a lot of influence and lobbying, and were able to kind of get things done. And it's been, I would say, probably since the 80s and 90s, especially with Bill Clinton, that the Democratic Party really began to distance itself from unions, and became more of a like a pro-business party. And so now I would say, both political parties in America are really pretty like pro-business and pro-Wall Street. Um, the Republicans more aggressively so, more kind of like blatantly and directly so, but the Democrats as well. And in part, it's because like both of those parties depend on wealthy donors. They depend on, banks and Wall Street institutions and big tech and big pharma and, big businesses in general. That's kind of like where their bread is buttered. And so, as much as they are like, competing for the votes of everyday ordinary people, they are also like beholden to these large donors, that, that's like where their money is coming from. And a lot of these politicians spend a lot of their time, what they spend their time doing, a lot is raising money. So, they might need the votes of people like you and I, but they also, more importantly, they really need the money of people that are like wealthy. And so I think this accounts for how much, like our government is increasingly in the thrall of this like oligarchy that we see today. So anyway, um, that was a pretty interesting poll. I thought I would have, like I said, I would have liked to have gotten a breakdown by political party, but I was not able to find that a poll like that. Um, but I think that what's interesting here is just that there's this kind of broad consensus that I would imagine is pretty like bipartisan. Like, people tend to, sort of agree or disagree here in a pretty unanimous way. And it's, kind of interesting to think about like, well, how like when it's like election season, these politicians, they talk, a good game about being, heroes of the little guy and champion of the working class. And, they always like come out with this kind of populist message. And then when they're in power, when it's not election time, their first priority is like, we got to cut taxes for the rich, or we got to like, cut these regulations, like we got to like make it easier to drill for oil or make it easier for, to build like data centers or, for AI to do whatever AI is going to do. Like election time, they like to talk a big game about being on the side of the little guy and the working people and the forgotten American and all this kind of thing. And then like when they're actually in office, the priorities, really reveal themselves. And it's like, oh yeah, they're there to serve the people that loaned them money in the form of campaign donations. Like they're there to serve the people that funded their campaigns. And I think the Republicans do this more blatantly and like unashamedly, and but the Democrats do it too, you know. And it's kind of like part of like why we're kind of like stuck in this situation. I guess most of the Democrats. I don't want to throw them all under the bus. I think there's some people that have some integrity out there. Yeah. Go ahead, Kai.
I feel like they all, it's like all a facade. And then, like, they all go home and then they all just like text each other and be like, oh my God, that was crazy or something like that.
Yeah, well, that would correspond to like what C. Wright Mills thinks about the power elite is that it's actually this kind of like this small, like kind of cabal of people who do like know each other, and they might, they fight in front of the cameras, but maybe they. I'm always surprised to learn that like some of these people in Congress and the Senate and the House, like who purport to really despise each other's opinions, like they sometimes like hang out socially, and I'm like, really? But that would go to sort of like your point about this, like that there's like a social network, like basically an elite social network of people who are really interconnected, and they play golf together. They go to the same country club. They might not like agree about certain policies, but they can all like, share a drink at the country club and then play around a golf. Like or their kids go to the same universities, like Ivy League places, or they sit on the board of, certain kinds of organizations or institutions. C. Wright Mills's concept, as we're going to see, is called the power elite, that sort of describes this kind of like social network, and it's a pretty small social network, but a social network of people who have like these overlapping ties with one another, and so as a result, they kind of like they all have a pretty similar perspective on things. And as a result, they're also kind of like out of touch with the rest of the population because they live in this kind of like bubble, you know, and they live in a pretty like exclusive elite bubble. And boy, has this really been exposed by like the Epstein files. Like that all these revelations about the Jeffrey Epstein's, island and all these people that he knew and just like how it seems like he just kind of knew everybody, like the richest people, the, famous people, politicians, and kind of like whether they were Republican or Democrat, whatever, like he knew, obviously he knew Donald Trump, but he also knew like Bill Clinton and like, the Prince Andrew and like,
Michael
like,
Jackson, like crazy things.
yeah, like Michael Jackson, Woody Allen, like Jay-Z is in the Epstein files. Like,
Sorry, something I want to add about the Epstein files while
yeah,
we're on it,
yeah,
um, is did anybody see that Prince Andrew was taken into custody?
yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, well, it was really interesting because there was a lot of discourse online, and people were basically just saying, like, if somebody in the royal family can be accountable, then what does that say about our country? And I just feel like the only reason we're being able to see all of this stuff is kind of more or less a distraction because we're not taking any action with all this information that's being released.
yeah. So there's a lot of just like the political will is just not there to prosecute in the same way. And I mean, it's just a kind of a classic, kind of cover up. Some heads have rolled. I saw that the former president of Harvard resigned today. So this guy, Larry Summers, who was, I think, Treasury Secretary under Obama, I think, and was, president of Harvard. So speaking of like the power elite, I think, resigned today from his position at Harvard. Um, but like, yeah, it's not just like Prince Andrew, like there, have been like aristocrats and rulers and, financiers and stuff in other countries that have lost their positions. So this is a scandal, not just in America, but like it involves a lot of elites like all over the world, have been exposed in this. Prince Andrew is probably the most famous one, but certainly not the only one. And to your point, yeah, it does show that there is like less political will in this country to prosecute people who are associated with that. And it's again, it it's kind of proving this point about this kind of untouchable power elite. Even when they're exposed, like nothing happens. Like Elon Musk is going to become the first trillionaire in the world history. Um, like pretty soon, and he's all over the Epstein files too. You know. Um, so anyway, it's pretty depressing, and it's like these guys act like they can get away with anything because pretty much like they kind of can and kind of have, you know, even when they got exposed, it's just like nothing really happened. Anyway, um, let me spend the last like 10 minutes here giving us a little bit of a preview of the ideas that we're going to be looking at in the next 2 weeks coming from Marxist and Weberian theories of power. This, okay. Okay, so I've mentioned C. Wright Mills here, and he'll be the first person that we kind of read directly. Let me just pull up the introduction to Mills's thing. This is a really famous book that was written in 1956 called The Power Elite, and it's kind of amazing. I mean, speaking of the Epstein stuff, it's kind of amazing how much this book still speaks to us, to our sort of condition today. Um, he his definition of the power elite is this kind of small group who tend to have what he calls like interlocking relationships. So you remember we've been talking about the concept of social networks, right? Like how it's not just like what you know, it's who you know, and so like people's power accrues not just from their wealth and their money, but the way that their wealth and their money allows them to know other people and to make these like social connections. And so, like Jeffrey Epstein is an excellent example of this. No one really knows how Jeffrey Epstein seems to have made so much money, but he seemingly knew everybody, or he knew everybody who was in positions of power, whether they were corporate elites, celebrities, political elites, or whatever. There's this like network, a social network. We all have social networks. We all have, people that we associate with and who influence us and people that we trust. But the elites, the power elite, have a particular kind of social network. And it's very interlocking across institutions. So, as it says here, like as a group, the top elite share similar socioeconomic backgrounds and recruits its members from a small set of leading universities and academies. So, the educational system is a really important filter for the creation of these elites. This is where these people, meet each other. In a lot of cases, they are part of like the same fraternity or the same sorority, or they like, vacation in Europe together, or, after college, they are able to get, like a sweet internship because of who their family is or what their name is. There's a way that like these elites um, perpetuate generation after generation. The whole idea that we kind of like to think is that people become elites based on their merit, because they're the smartest or the hardworking, the most hardworking, or they have the best ideas or whatever. And in some cases that might be the case, but in a tremendous amount of cases it is not. It is often that like people become elites because they're like born into the elite. What's the expression? People, like nepo babies, like people that kind of like, they just they're just like born with a silver spoon in their mouth or whatever, and like they're able to succeed despite their own mediocre talents, because they know the right people and they have like a name that carries weight, and they went to Yale or Harvard or Stanford or whatever, and like they met other elite people. And so it's not always the case that like these are the smartest and hardworking people. I think that they are probably people of average talents, just like the rest of us. Some are smarter than others, some are more hardworking than others, but like they succeed more because of like their background, and because of the social networks that they travel in. And so Mills says there is considerable fluidity between these top positions. that people move from corporations to the government, they move from the military to corporations, they move from the government to corporations. There is a like a revolving door of elites within these big three institutions. Mills says basically the big three institutions for power in America are corporations, the government, and the military. And so those three institutions, there's like a kind of like a symbiosis. Uh, there, there's a fluidity in which people kind of move from one to another. So a lot of times you'll see like politicians, for example, will retire or they'll lose their seat or they'll, leave Congress or whatever, and they'll immediately become like lobbyists or they'll go to work for some corporation. They'll become a figurehead of the corporate of a corporation. Or there's certainly a lot of like fluidity between like the military and the government, so that you have like these military defense contractors like Palantir or BlackRock, these kind of like private weapons, even Elon Musk's what is the other thing? Not Tesla, but uh, this his spaceship thing. Like all of these, what is it?
SpaceX, I think.
SpaceX. Thank you. Yes, I couldn't remember it. Yeah, like all of those things are like ostensibly they are private entities, but they are making money because of government contracts. They're a way that like the military and private business are connected. You may have heard this term before, the military industrial complex. This is kind of a little bit about like what Mills is talking about, the kind of like incestuous connections between the military and like private corporations. The term military industrial complex was first coined by President Dwight Eisenhower, actually a Republican president, on his way out of office in 1960. Giving up the office to JFK, who was coming in and just been elected. And so in his last speech, Eisenhower warns Americans about the growing power of the military industrial complex. The way that like the military was enshrined, connected with like these for-profit corporations that the more war and conflict there is, the more profit they make. They have a vested interest in a dangerous and violent world. And today that situation is probably even more extreme than it was in 1960. So this is about a bit of what Mills is all on about. For the next time, I'm going to give you. I'm going to just like post this optional article, and it'd be interesting, to read and discuss. But I'm just going to make it strictly optional. This came out a couple of what is this like? Earlier this month, this thing about coming back to C. Wright Mills in our current age, and particularly this book, The Power Elite. So it was published in 1956, a much different time in a lot of ways. But this article is basically suggesting like there are all these ways in which Mills's diagnosis of the power elite is just as relevant today, perhaps even more relevant today, than it was, I don't know, 70 years ago. I guess we're coming up on the 70-year anniversary of this book. And yet, in many ways, like, uh, not a lot has changed. And perhaps things have even just gotten even more extreme. So that'll be fun. We'll talk about that when I get back from our great North American neighbor. So wish me luck in Canada, and I will talk. The next time I will talk to you will be a week from today, Wednesday. What is that? March 4th, I think. So we'll be talking about C. Wright Mills. We'll talk about we'll probably get to Michael Mann and Timothy Lukes a little bit later, but I'm very much looking forward to talking about um, C. Wright Mills and the book The Power Elite. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for the discussion today. I thought that was really interesting, and for participating in the poll. I'm glad. I'm very especially thankful for those of you who are here in the live session. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.
Good
Bye.
luck. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a nice weekend, Professor.
Thank you.
Bye. Best of
Bye.
luck.
Thank you.
Safe travels.
All right. Thank you.